talk and nothing will happen, right? And so one historian called the Senate, he said, the great revenge the South got on the North for the Battle of Gettysburg. And effectively, the Southerners in the Senate were a minority, but they were able to stop any meaningful federal civil rights legislation from the 1860s all the way up until 1958. The Senate passes no civil rights bills. It passes nothing with segregation, no anti-lynching legislation, nothing. And it's the story of the 1958 civil rights bills is an epic one, but it didn't even do anything. It allowed violations of civil rights to be tried at the state level by a state jury, which of course meant that effectively anybody doing something like this would simply get acquitted, probably by people in the crowd. Right? And so the 1958 Civil Rights Bill was a civil rights bill, but it didn't do anything. Right? We'll talk about that because it's an important milestone in the career of Senate Majority Leader Lyndon Johnson. And so, having said that, we'll come back to the Senate and why it's a big deal. But effectively, sort of what is to be done about this? The African Americans are not stupid. They know this is happening. It's happening in front of their eyes, right? And so there's a number of things you can say. Frederick Douglass, himself a former slave, born into slavery in Maryland, on his deathbed, a young man says, Mr. Douglass, what are we supposed to do? The Civil War happened, we were freed, but it's worse than it ever was in a sense, right? And Douglass takes the guy's hand and he says, agitate, agitate, agitate. Just fight as long as you can, just forever. And so that's a tough call because, as you might imagine, things are stacked against you, right? And so the NAACP is founded to do that, to fight segregation. The NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, was founded specifically to get those things into court. They said if you get a judge at a federal court and you read this stuff to him and quote the 14th Amendment, he would throw it out, right? You would think. And so on the other hand, Booker T. Washington had founded the Tuskegee Institute to take the smartest African-American young men and educate them. And his argument was you can't fight the system from inside the system. You can't use everything. So instead, we focus on improving the African-Americans' economic position, jobs. And he said, we got to make a guy, an African-American man who is so intelligent, who is so sort of good in every respect that he could not be discriminated against, right? It's got this sort of, in this sense, idealistic vision that if African-Americans made themselves the intellectual, moral equals of the white man, then it would be, the discrimination would seem odd or ridiculous and just go away. And so he got a lot of attention because in 1885 he spoke at a big expo in Georgia, the Cotton States and International Exposition, and he said the black man can't meet the open hand of the white man with a closed fist, right? You've got to meet hand in hand. You've got to cooperate to make the South grow together. And of course, white people took it as a tacit endorsement of segregation. Washington thought of himself as a realist, right? He didn't want how many people have to die protesting segregation, right? But it was a very deeply, deeply controversial thing. W.E.B. Du Bois hated Washington and thought of him as a sellout, right? I mean, you can't, if you for a minute accept that this is okay, then you've sold your soul, right? And that's it, right? And so, in effect, the defining characteristic of African-American political life from 1876 to 1954 is segregation and fighting it, right? Is the organized resistance to it in some fashion, right? And so, it's hard to argue that it's not, in a sense, the dominant story in the background of the late 19th and early 20th century, politically speaking, right? Republicans, they still get delegates at their convention from the southern states, but there's no Republican office holders in the South. And the Democrats, if you're a northern Democrat, it's a wonderful situation you're in. If you are a Democrat from New Jersey running for president, do you have to campaign in the South? No, they're just going to vote Democrat, right? You're going to get Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Florida, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Texas, and Arkansas without trying to do anything. You'll just get them. Campaign elsewhere. On the other hand, though, if you're a Democrat, what deal do you have to make? You get those votes, and in return, as a Democratic president, do you support civil rights? Do you talk about civil rights? No, you don't. You just mum's the word, right? Keep your mouth shut, and you get more votes. Now, could a Southerner ever get elected president coming from one of these Southern states? No, they'd ask him some questions, right? Like, were you in the KKK, or do you like this stuff? Or you Southern have to get votes from New Hampshire to get elected, right? He'd have to go to Massachusetts and ask questions about what he did when he was a young man in the 1880s. And of course, the answer would probably doom him, right? In the 1950s, Georgia Senator Richard Russell, who's an urbane, cultured man, reads Greek and Latin at home at night. He runs for president. It's time to have a Southerner as president, he says. He runs for president. The other senators, they respect Richard Russell. They know him. They like him. He goes up to New Hampshire and he gets slaughtered. He comes in like 7th out of 7 in the primary. And he doesn't understand it. And finally, a New Hampshire senator takes him aside and says, Richard, you got to understand. When you go up to New Hampshire, they just assume that you're a Southerner, you're from Georgia, they know what that means. And Richard Russell's shocked. I mean, he's not one of these KKK, but he said, because hicks and rednecks. He's a cultured man. And the New Hampshire senator says, look, they just assume all of you just are KKK guys from down there, right? They just assume that you're all, out in the woods shooting black people at night kind of a thing. And so that's the deal the Southerners make. It's protection for segregation, the end of Reconstruction in return for maybe no national politics for a while, right? No Southern Democrats, as it turns out until the mid-20th century or later, right? And so, having said that, rest assured, we will return to this issue, right? Yeah.
I do have a question.
Sure.
So, what is the penalty then for whites opposing the persecution of colors? Like, I mean, obviously.
I mean, like, what do you mean specifically? Like,
so obviously, like, not everybody in the South agreed with these laws, especially like.
oh, I mean, like, if you're a white person, would you speak out? Oh, well, that's fine.
Yeah.
You just get blackballed. I mean, like, are you a businessman? Would you like to have partners? I mean,
They'll lynch and they'll turn on you. Like, they'll lynch.
I see.
Yeah.
So-
like, if you're a nice person from society, don't expect to be invited to any parties. Don't expect it. And if you're a businessman and you depend on like other, like if you run a trucking company, well, rest assured, I won't be needing your business because you're trying to rock the boat and agitate and all that good stuff. Yeah. And so there's a fairly heavy penalty associated with speaking out of this. Now, it doesn't stop some white people from doing it. A lot of newspaper editors publish editorials, and there's a lot of people who argue that we got to go into the 20th century, we got to build the economy, we're getting left behind, this whole segregation is helping us. The price of cotton utterly collapses in the 19th century, so there's this whole argument about like, why are we talking about sharecropping? That's useless. I mean, we can't, having black people out here picking cotton is terrible for them, and it's also not getting us any money because the price of cotton is a 50th of what it was in 1860. But you might say there's a heavy social price to be paid for that kind of a public stand for quite a while.
So just suck all around.
Kind of, yeah. And so there's not a more, if you watch, ironically, it's gotten criticized a lot, but if you watch the movie The Help, the main character doesn't like it, but when she complains about it, it's sort of like, you're wrong, like, don't talk about it, it's not really it's the way it is, it's the way it's always been. Like, let the guys in charge decide, and it's just sort of, and things will change when, ironically, fairly rapidly, things change in the South. Segregation goes away. The South sort of changes within a very quick period of time, but also the thing that's worth mentioning is that in the 20th century, segregation would have become increasingly difficult to defend. I mean, we go to war in World War II to fight Nazis, and then you come home and you treat black people like second-class citizens. That's a little hard to get around. With the Americans who fought in the Pacific hated the British because the British treated the people in their colonies like shit. We had American troops in India, and they hated the goddamn British who ordered these Indians around like they were jerks. And the Southeast Asia Command, we joke, was saved England's Asian colonies. And it was like, I'm not gonna go die, so some British dude can lord it over some Indians in Bombay, right? But on the other hand, what quickly happened is that when communism became a threat in the 50s, the civil rights movement immediately became, in a lot of Southerners' minds, linked with communist agitation. And so then all of a sudden it's like, well, look, I don't know about segregation, but I do know the civil rights movement is full of communists. And so do you want to give in? Do you want to give the communists a victory? Is that what you want? Are you one of those communists? And of course, Martin Luther King struggled heavily with that. Do you kick communists out of the civil rights movement because it's bad for the movement to have them there? Or do you tolerate them because the only American political party that let black people in on an equal basis in the 20th century was the American Communist Party? So like, do you just say, sorry guys, it's not working out, get out? But that became suddenly a super easy way to just dismiss all civil rights agitation. They're just agitators, they're probably paid by Russia, probably being paid by the communists, come over here and wreck everything in our nice state, right? But of course, ironically, overseas, our support for segregation was viewed as a major mark against us, right? Nixon went to Ghana, the first independent African nation created in the 20th century, and he went to go to the reception, and the Ghanaian government wouldn't even talk to him. They were like, sorry, you got, no thanks. And so Kennedy got some very pointed questions about that in Germany when he went to go talk to the people in West Berlin. They were like, yeah, you're great, but like, when are you gonna let black people vote? And so, but yeah, I think there was this sort of, this is the consensus, and outside agitation was viewed. I mean, look at how Reconstruction was. People from outside trying to come in and tell us how to do things, and that's not what we want, right? So for the last little bit, we'll get started talking about the next topic. We'll pick it up again when we get together next time, but let's talk briefly about the West and the Indians. So if you look at the West, I think this is this is an awful picture. It's called American Progress, and I'm 100% certain it's in the book because it's literally in every American history textbook, because it's sort of one of those textbook pictures, right? No one would ever have this in their house because it's ugly and terrible, but it's one of those pictures that perfectly captures a sort of a moment in time, right? So here you have the 19th century conception of the West as written by white Americans, right? Here you have Progress is the Greek goddess flying over the Great Plains. And look, in the east, the sun is coming up. You have the big cities. It looks like probably New York. You've got all ships and bridges and railroads going west. She's stringing telegraph wires, right? She's literally bringing the future with her as she goes. And then you've got all these guys who's farmers and prospectors and wagon trains and carriages going west. And then she's headed west, bringing civilization with her, right? And the Indians are fleeing into the darkness, right? Because they're scared, they don't understand, they're savages, they don't get it. And by the way, she's got a book under her arm of all the books in the universe that it could be, without knowing specifically what book probably is it. Yes, if it's a book in a picture and the person isn't holding up the cover of the book and like pointing to it, it's probably the Bible, right? And so this picture, again, from an artistic perspective, it's horrible and it's ugly and it's awful and it's ill executed, I'm sure. But at the same time, it's a perfect statement of what a lot of white people thought about the 19th century. Right? If you grabbed a white person on the streets of a big city in the East Coast and you said, "What do you make of the West?" and how do you see it? They would basically tell you this picture. Right? We're civilized. Right? We have a civilized, high-tech society. We have the telegraph, electricity, railroads, skyscrapers, bridges. We have all this great technology, and we're trying to civilize the frontier over here and sort of bring everything into the 20th century. And the Indians just sort of like they're not part of that. They don't want to be part of it. They're not able to be part of it. They're just not interested in being part of it. I don't know the reason, but the vision of the sort of the country spreading out into the west and sort of filling in all the map, clearing the forest and building roads doesn't really include Indians. They're savages, right? And so a few things you can say. First, is this a new story in American history? Oh, of course not. Right? People have been doing this since the 16 teens, right? The first settlers in Jamestown in Virginia fought with the Indians over land. The Puritans had their fights with the Indians. The first Thanksgiving wasn't in Massachusetts, it was in Virginia, and it was food that the Indians gave and then more food that the settlers stole. So it's obviously not what we all learned in middle school. But that's not a new story. And if you took the first part of this class, American History 1, or if you do take it, that's a long-running theme in the class, right? And so there were Indians all over the continent, and then for some reason there were, right? And of course, there's other countries that do this in the 19th century as well. In South Africa, the frontier is not the west, it's the north, right? And it's the Afrikaners pushing the San and the Xhosa in the north. If you talk about Australia and the Aboriginal peoples and the white settlers, it's the same kind of a story. If you look at Argentina, there's a frontier in the north there. Russia has its own frontier going east into Siberia. And so it's a very similar thing. You can compare those countries and get some interesting insights by looking at them. But definitely, this is a major part of the 19th century in America, is the settlement of the frontier and the expansion of the country into the west and the development of this sort of country that goes from, as they say, from sea to shining sea, right? And the Indians are just sort of seen as being kind of not just an anomalous thing that needs to be kind of dealt with first, right? And so a few things you can mention. Settlement of the plains had basically stopped during the Civil War. As you could imagine, people stopped going west and started defending the settlements that already made. Soldiers who were fighting the Indians mostly went east and fought in the Civil War. The frontier in Texas was actually pushed back east 100 miles by the Comanche Indians during the war. They got wise and realized that there's nobody with guns hanging around because they're all fighting each other in the east. So what they did is they started massacring people and pushing the frontier back 100 miles. A stripe, north to south, 100 miles wide, got pushed back east. And that was people's property, their homes that they built, their farms. Now, of course, technically it was Indian territory, but I mean, those people, they bought it legally, they got it in ways they thought were fair. And so as you can imagine, the Comanche were pretty brutal. They traveled in these bands. The Comanche, their territory, by the way, was everything that they could ride on a horse. That was their definition of it. They borrowed the word from the Spanish Comancheria, because they didn't have a word for it before the Spanish came in the 1400s. And Comancheria went from essentially the Dakotas, the Mississippi, and the Rockies all the way down to central Mexico in a big oval. And it was whenever they ride on a horse. And they rode all over it, they raided all over it. The original intent of bringing settlers into Texas in the 1820s on the Mexicans was to get people to essentially settle the area to provide a buffer for the Comanche who'd migrate into the region and wreck everything. Maybe let them raid those white guys we get into eastern Texas instead of us. And so the Comanche had essentially they were total anarchists, right? They were a true libertarian sort of anarchistic society. They had no rules. You do whatever you want. You do whatever you want as long as you want. There was no school, there was no military, there was no taxes, there was no laws, there was no religious institutions. One historian has argued that, in a sense, the entirety of civilization is taking aggressive young men of fighting age and